It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce once again Ron Jenkins. Ron is a longtime member of the National Yacht Club. His father, Al, past purser of shellbacks, Class A dinghy sailor, and an active keelboat owner. And his grandfather, Herb, NYC treasurer for decades, an active keelboat sailor, carries the Jenkins name well back in National Yacht Club history. Herb had a wonderful style to deal with all kinds of difficult matters with a deft touch. And so it continues in the family. Ron is an active nature and sailing photographer. When hobbies don't interfere, he works in technology marketing. In the technological area, Ron is our webmaster. He weekly records the sessions, uploads them to our web, and in addition to loading our schedule and any other pertinent information. In photography, since COVID began, he daily posts an interesting little puzzle of a picture on his Facebook page and challenges you to figure out what it is. So look him up on Facebook and check out those interesting little pictures. He's an active participant in Waterfront for All, a coalition of groups protecting the Toronto waterfront. Ron's topic today is sailing the Rideau Canal. In 2023, Ron, a sailor, decided to do a power boat thing and travel the Rideau Canal from Kingston to Ottawa and back. And I bring him up now for his 13th time speaking to shellbacks. And please give him a warm shellback welcome.
Thank you, Diane. Am I in camera view? Good. Okay. Well, it's great to see you all here. Happy New Year. Glad you came out against the cold. And I think what I'll do is start by asking how many of you have been on the Rideau Canal? You. Oh, more than a few. Okay. Well, I don't have to do anything else. I guess we have to talk myself. One of the, sorry?
Frozen, does that count?
When it's frozen, yeah, I've been on it frozen too. The interesting thing today is a couple of our guests and new folks here traveled on the Rideau in the same kind of boat that I was on last summer. Gail and Alan. So anyway, we start here with a picture of Colonel Bly, the chief engineer of the Rideau Canal. And we'll talk more about him later, but what you can see are some people dressing stones for the locks in here. And they've got a crane rigged up there for hoisting things. The crane actually looks a lot like the cranes of National Yacht Club, especially one down at the far end. So I'll start with some of the history just so you understand the context. The Rideau Canal was a response really to the War of 1812. And in 1812, the British were concerned about the American influence on the St. Lawrence River. The British wanted to be able to travel. I gotta go back to full screen. Wanted to be able to travel from Lower Canada to Upper Canada using the St. Lawrence River, and they were concerned about American interference on that route. But protecting that lifeline between Montreal and Kingston was critical. So they began reinforcing military points along the way. And that included defenses at Citadel Hill in Halifax, and the Citadel in Quebec City, and Fort Henry and Kingston. And the route was intended to go westward from Montreal along St. Lawrence and then up the Ottawa River. And eventually coming through a couple of canals that were dug to get around rapids on the Ottawa River, and then from Ottawa down to Kingston and out to Lake Ontario. And you can see some of the military structure along the route today, including blockhouses. And these blockhouses, there are 4 of them along the Rideau route. How does that work? Oh, it works there. Okay. Kingston Mills, Newborough have existing blockhouses. Colonel By talks about them. He says the lower part of these blockhouses I propose building with stone, there being a sufficient quantity remaining at each station from the rock excavation to enable that part to be built with masonry with walls 4 feet thick at the same price as timber. These walls would support strong flooring beams with a layer of masonry to render the lower stories fireproof and nearly bomb-proof, as shown by the section. The roofs and timber work I propose covering with tin, which will render these buildings very durable and difficult to destroy by fire, as tin remains free from rust in this climate upwards of 60 years. So it was really a military route in its original intent. And this is the blockhouse, another one at the Upper Narrows. This is one of the locks along the route. And this is a picture from the 1841, showing the Newborough blockhouse and the lock at Newborough. And it doesn't look very different today than it looked there. You can see that. The lock looks different, however, because of the traffic involved. Obviously, these are not British soldiers. This is a busy lock, as you can see. It joins a couple of recreational lakes. So it's one of the busiest of the locks. In fact, the busiest lock on the Rideau Canal. Another large blockhouse is at Merrickville. This is the largest blockhouse on the Rideau Canal, and it's now a museum. And there were also lock keepers' houses. The lock masters had housing at each lock station. This one is at Jones Falls, and what you can see here is that lockmaster's house, as well as the lock itself, or one of the locks at Jones Falls. 11 of these lockmasters' houses remain today. In fact, one of the remarkable things about the Rideau Canal itself is, although it was built between 1826 and 1832, a great deal of it remains as it was at the time, which is really part of why it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So this is another one of the views of that lockmaster's house. And you can see the slits for windows there as like this, you'd be sticking a gun at those, fighting off Americans, and the need never happened. Well, I should say it hasn't happened yet. Yes.
What was the name of the building lock?
That was Newborough. Oh, the busiest lock was Newborough. So talk a little bit about Colonel By. He was born 1779 in London and selected in 1826 as the engineer for the Rideau Canal. And it took 5 working seasons to build the Rideau Canal. It was through wilderness. And at the time, it was the largest engineering project in the British Empire. And you really don't get an idea of it until you travel the Rideau Canal and see the stonework at each one of the 47 locks along the way. So by 1832, it was complete, and Colonel By and his family boarded the steamship Pumper, renamed Rideau in honor of the occasion for the inaugural journey through the completed canal. He was recalled to England soon after to answer for overspending on the canal. And he was scapegoated and died unhappily in 1836. But his reputation was more recently revived. He became a designated National Historic Person in 1954. Didn't do much good, but there you go. The canal construction was a major project. And it seems that there were between 2,500 and 4,000 men at work at any one time on the construction of the canal. And these men came from Quebec and Ireland by and large. And they were not quite slave labor, but they were underpaid and overworked. And Colonel By remarks in 1827, I therefore expect to collect a great number of persons on the works by the 1st May, and fear from the wretched condition of most of the emigrants applying to me for work that it will be indispensable necessary to issue bedding to prevent sickness. At present, the poor fellows lay with nothing but their rags to cover them, and their numbers are increasing. In the rainy season coming on, I dread the effects of sickness and feel convinced that the distribution of bedding will be of the greatest importance. And sickness among the workers was a very big deal. It was malaria. We think of malaria as affecting the construction of the Panama Canal, perhaps, but this was in Ontario. Sometimes called ague or swamp fever. The workers lived in crowded residence and far from treatment. They couldn't afford any rent, in any rate, and they were clearing many acres of forest to get through the canal. So Colonel By cleared forest to try to improve air circulation. They didn't really understand the mechanism of transmission. They didn't identify it with mosquitoes per se, but they thought it was part of the pestilence of the swamps and so on. There was one of the first buildings erected at Barracks Hill in Ottawa, which is the location of the current Parliament buildings, was originally a hospital, a military hospital. And there was a cemetery very nearby also. So this is an early picture, 1834. This is looking across the Ottawa River. And, oops, I did that, sorry. You can bring it back up full screen. Thank you. So up here is the hospital. This is on the hill that's now Parliament Hill. And this is the canal going up from the Ottawa River. So this set of locks still exists. And over here now is where you would have the Chateau Laurier. I think that gives you the position of things. And the cemetery was located right here at the junction of Albert Street and Queen and a couple of others. Modern construction has turned up that cemetery, but I guess it's all built over now. There were a couple of markers put up in the 21st century, in Ottawa and Kingston, marking the contributions of these workers, particularly the Irish. These are Irish crosses. The inscription on the cross in Kingston says, in memory of an estimated 1,000 Irish laborers and their co-workers who died of malaria and by accidents in terrible working conditions while building the Rideau Canal, 1826 to 1832. And one thing you can see on the cross in Ottawa is the pick and shovel for the workers, the Irish harp, an explosion because of course they were digging their way through rock, the wheelbarrow, and the malaria carrying mosquito. Along the Rideau Canal route too, you will sometimes be able to find old cemeteries, abandoned now. Cemeteries have been found at Chappie's, Newborough, Merrickville, and some other possible locations. These are where workers who died on the site were buried on this. Their names are forgotten, but there are sometimes stones marking graves. So now we'll talk a little about the geography of the Rideau Canal, because it's kind of interesting, or it was to me at least. The Rideau Canal involves two rivers. It involves the Cataraqui River that goes from Kingston uphill, and it involves the Rideau River that goes from the midpoint along the canal downstream to Ottawa. So there are two watersheds that are parts of that. The Cataraqui watershed is here, going from Kingston up to Big Rideau Lake, and the Rideau River watershed that runs downhill into Ottawa. Which really means that you go up locks until one point and then you go down locks the other way. So it's lifting you over an arch. And that arch in part is part of the geology of the area. The Frontenac axis is what we would maybe more often call the Canadian Shield. So when you start going up from Kingston, it's not very far before the landscape changes from that sort of Kingston limestone into more of a granite. And you're going through a lake that looks a lot more like Muskoka in this section. And then when you get past that point at Newborough, most of the route going from Big Rideau Lake onwards past Smiths Falls and up to Ottawa is all on more or less flat plain. And you're in a slow flowing wide river. Oops. So Upper Rideau Lake is the geographical midpoint. That high point is 83 meters up from Ottawa and 50 meters up from Lake Ontario. The Rideau Canal today, I'll start you at Kingston Mills. This is the first lock that you encounter as you come from Kingston. You go up through a bit of a sort of a marsh area under the Highway 401. And very soon after that, you get to the first lock called Kingston Mills. And this is the boat I was traveling on, a Scout 30 called Ragtime. And this is the same boat that Alan and Gail had, and in fact traveled on the Rideau Canal themselves some years earlier. Not sure exactly when. Ragtime was at National until 3 or 4 years ago. Now it's in the Outer Harbor. So this is just about to enter the first lock coming from Kingston. And it's on what's called the blue line. The docks are painted blue where you can dock to wait for the lock to open when you're route. And this is an aerial view of Kingston Mills. What you can see here across the bottom is a railway line, across the top is a roadway. And there's a set of locks. You go up 3 locks. So that's the first lock. The second lock takes you another step up. The third lock takes you further. The fourth lock is through a turning basin and then another fourth lock, and you're on the lake, Colonel By Lake, which is a lake that was created by a dam and raises the water level above that area by something like 35 or 40 feet. So when that dam was built, there was a large new area of flooded water that goes from there up to the next lock up the canal. So the dam is there, marking, and Kingston Mills is so named because originally there was a mill there on the rapids flowing downhill from the late 1700s. So Kingston Mills existed as a mill site before the Rideau Canal. So this is what you'll see if you come from Lake Ontario. This is the very first lock to get to. This is the start, and These are how these locks are operated. With the exception of only 3 locks, all of these locks are manually operated in exactly the same way they were operated when the canal was built. So this fellow is cranking a winch that hoists up a sluice. You can see the metal bars would go up and down depending on which way it cranks. So he's operating a sluice. The 3 locks that are non-manual were converted in the 1960s by Transport Canada, and then somebody said, wait a minute, you're taking away an important heritage route, and they stopped those conversions. This is the second lock on your way up. So now you're going underneath the railway bridge. And you'll see this lock again on the way going back, but this is how these gates are opened and closed, the same way with a winch and a chain that pulls them open or pushes them closed. And this is looking out from the 4th lock up. You can see the dam over to the right. You can also see Ragtime here sitting in the morning, waiting for the dock to open, the gates to open to go down back. This is on the return trip, this picture. So I'll just give you some numbers on the Rideau Canal so you understand a little bit. Each of the locks is the same size. So the locks are 33 feet wide and 134 feet long, but the boats that fit in have to be a bit smaller than that because you have a threshold on each of the locks and the gates need room to swing in and so on. The water depth is 5 feet or more, which really means you're not going to be traveling there in your sailboat. And the other thing is that the height on the bridges, you have 22 feet. After that, you're out of height. Those are on the fixed bridges. There are 45 locks plus 2 more on the Tay Canal. And there are lock stations numbered 23. That's because, like the Kingston Mills counts as 1 lock station, but it has 4 locks. So you look at the numbers. When you go up to Ottawa and back, if you don't go on the Tay Canal, you actually go through 90 locks, which accustoms you to the routines very quickly. So the route is 202 kilometers of the Rideau Canal from Kingston to Ottawa. 19 kilometers of that is artificially created channels. The rest is lakes and rivers that join sections. But those lakes and rivers, in some cases, in many cases, were actually created in the canal making process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. As far as traffic on the canal, this was just last year and the year before. What you can see, the busiest lock is right here at the Narrows. And the number of boats going through all the locks, about 56,000 vessels. And if you look at the breakdown, about half of those are Ontario, maybe a third are Quebec, and a good chunk still, maybe 10% are from the United States. This is just a useful thing for people traveling on the canal. Each one of the lock stations is enumerated with information about whether you can camp overnight, where the washrooms are, barbecue grills, whether they're available, whether there's power available if you're docking, and so on. And these are this is just a collection of information on the distances between the locks and the lock stations, because sometimes the lock stations are close together, but other times they're quite far apart. So once, for example, you get up through Kingston Mills, you go, I think it's yeah, it's a 90, it's not broken down here, but it's about 20 kilometers before you get to the next lock. But then in other spots, the lock stations are maybe only 1.5 kilometers apart. So along the way, you have fellow travelers. Power boats almost entirely. I did see one sailboat. It was a 26-foot non-such with its mast down. So in here, you've got a good sized 45-foot power boat, and you've got a pontoon boat with actually a 450 horsepower motor on there. So these sometimes we were traveling in a boat that tops out around 7 knots, 7 to 8, and we'd leave a lock, and then one of these things would go flying past us. And then half an hour later, we'd get to the next lock and it would be waiting there because the lock hadn't opened yet. So you can choose your pace. You can hurry up and wait, or you can just putter along.
It's no different than driving.
It's
Yeah,
like
you're
traffic.
racing to the red light.
Yeah. These are a couple of boats heading into the lock at Chaffee's. These happen both to be American boats, just as a matter of interest. You can't see it, but this boat here was actually from Fort Myers in Florida. This other one is also from Florida. But what you can also see is the shape of the lock itself. And that looks just like the same lock in a drawing from 1841. So these high lock walls are the same lock walls that you see here. Here's another lock, and it's got a bridge that's swung out of the way at the moment. Small powerboat and a houseboat going through. And these are boats waiting to come or go through the lock. There is ragtime over here and other boats. This is the largest boat that travels through the Rideau Canal. It's the Kawartha Voyager, ragtime in the foreground. The Kawartha Voyager is actually longer than the length of a lock. So you do wonder how that's possible. That's how. It actually folds up the bow to fit into the lock. It's designed, in other words, for the Rideau Canal. There it is, with a good couple of feet to spare. The Kawartha Voyager fills, when it's in the lock, it's in the lock by itself. It fits most of the width and all of the length. In earlier days, though, the Rideau Canal was not strictly a recreational thing. Oh, by the way, the Kawartha Voyager, you can book passages on, and you get your meals and your room, and you can travel the Rideau that way. Earlier, though, after the military intent was kind of unimportant anymore, the Rideau Canal was a freight channel. And this is a picture from 1920 in Ottawa. So the Ottawa River is in the background there. This freight barge is just entering the last lock on its way into the Ottawa River. The Rideau Canal did open a lot of logging through the area and a certain amount of mining as well.
Is that man on the tiller?
Yes, he's hauling on what's a really long tiller.
Wow.
You can see the rudder angled here, and the long tiller, the rudder post is here. So yeah, he's steering. There were also passenger ferries along the Rideau Canal, not just the Kawartha Voyager, but much earlier as well. This is from 1840 by, I've shown a couple of pictures of these. These were artists. The artist was Thomas Burroughs, and he documented a fair bit of the Rideau Canal in the 1840s. So this is a paddle wheel steamer called the Hunter on Lake Pinnacon, which is one of the lakes on the Rideau Canal. And through into the early 20th century too, there were some significant boats traveling on the Rideau Canal. I showed you those two American boats going into Chaffee's. This boat is coming out of Chaffee's, the same lock, the Rideau King. And these boats had luxurious accommodation or luxurious for the time. And traveled along the Rideau from Ottawa to Kingston, passenger traffic. This is the Rideau King also coming out of the upper lock into the turning basin at Jones Falls. And I already talked about the lockkeeper's house. And that's the same lockkeeper's house there. So these places haven't changed much in the last almost 200 years. And this is the Rideau Queen, another tour boat coming down through Kingston Mills. And I showed you those locks going up Kingston Mills under the railway tracks. That's coming down under the railway tracks. It's the same thing. I thought it was quite remarkable when you looked at the traveling through history as well as geography. In the early 1900s too, a large house was converted and expanded into a hotel. And that building still exists today. You can go there.
I had lunch there.
You had lunch there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Owned by the king.
Then there's nature and wildlife to be seen along the route. And of course, as I like taking pictures of that. There's shell and a water speckled maple leaf and some lily pads and things. Swans. Echinacea, yes, thank you. Balloon. Milkweed, thistle, another swan.
Oh, no.
What was a swan? Guard snake, cormorant, lots of Canada geese and spots. And here's a puzzle for you. I must have seen, I said, about 100 seagulls standing on navigation marks along the way. And they were always on the green marks and never on the red marks. And I'll answer the mystery to that. You got it. I puzzled about it for a while until I started taking a little closer look at the red ones.
We have to take care.
So anyway, as we headed up into Ottawa, the canal changes its character. Just south of Ottawa, there were canoe clubs, kayaking, and so on. So these women were kayaking here. It looks like the one in the stern maybe is not really enjoying herself, but there's a lot of canoeing and kayaking and so on right there. So you have to sort of, as you're heading through, not run these people over. There are lots of waterfront properties too, and they're all distinguished by the variety of ways that they arrange their red Muskoka chairs
They all red?
to express their individuality. They're all red. They're not all red. I selected, but the vast majority are red. And of course, you can see hundreds of them. When we got there into Ottawa, we were overheating, and what had happened was we had sucked weeds in through the water intake, and it had blocked the water intake. And that's our impeller, looking a little the worse for wear. So we were docked for a couple of days until we could get somebody to come and put a fresh impeller in. we didn't have a spare ourselves. I could change with the impeller now, but I didn't know what was going on then. And then down in the corner here is just a sort of a little reminder of the fact that the boat had 2 fuel tanks and we ran out of fuel twice. Which is not as idiotic as it sounds. The tanks in this boat are flat bottom tanks. And so when the tank was reading a quarter, it was out, or it could be out because the gas would slop and suck in air. And then, of course, you would want to throw these levers over to the other tank, except that because you'd sucked in air, the other tank wouldn't operate until you primed it. This is stuff I learned. A sailboat, I know what to do. Yeah, that's powerboat. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a lock called Kilmarnock, because in a way it's kind of very typical of the locks at the time the Rideau Canal was built, and it embodies a lot of the challenges of construction as well. It's called a solitude lock, and you'll know why if you're there. It's located between Smiths Falls and Merrickville, and at night there's really nothing around. You don't see much light from nearby towns or anything. It's also an excellent example of locks in the original state. So it has the lock itself, it has a dam, it has a swing bridge, and it has a lock master's house. So these are all elements from the original time. And it's also an example of called slackwater canal construction. A lot of the Rideau Canal was constructed this way. What slackwater canal construction is basically damming off a section of river so that the water rises enough that you have a navigable passage up to the next lock. So a great deal of the lakes and wide parts of rivers between Ottawa and Kingston were created this way, flooding areas that would have been too shallow for navigation, because it's a lot easier to build a dam and flood an area than to dig canals along the whole route. And this particular lock is also an example of challenges that Colonel By and the canal workers experienced when they were building the Rideau Canal. And an example of why he ran into cost overruns, among other things. So this is an aerial view of that lock, and there's a road here. This is the lock station itself and the lock channel, and the river route is this way. So the lock is cutting across a shallower sort of piece of land and making its route that way. This is another view that shows the lock in a little bit more of an aerial view, a little closer in. There's the bridge. This bridge swings out of the way on a central pivot, and it really only takes 1 or 2 people to push it, and it can swing. This lock has an opening and a closing here, so this lock station only has 1 lock. Boats coming and going dock here and there, and then over on this side up here is the river route, and there's a dam that you don't really see and a kind of an embankment along here. This is another view of the same lock, looking from the air, and now you can see the lock keeper's house as well over on the right. And this is the bridge itself, called an unequal arm center bearing timber swing bridge. It's actually a king post truss design unequal arm center bearing timber swing bridge. And the king post is the vertical post here that basically supports a couple of wires that hold the ends up for rigidity. So it's diagonally braced that way. Very simple design, very effective. When we were going through underneath, I decided to take a picture of the wheels that roll. So you can see how it doesn't show quite as well here, but these are old. The bridge has been rebuilt a few times, but the mechanics of it are the same. And there's the lock keeper's house there. These locks have a lot of history and a lot of it's well documented. So, for example, this is the history of lock keepers on this lock from 1846 right up until 2000. They know who the lock keepers were. There's also detailed documentary evidence on the construction of each lock. So this is at the lock looking east. The next station that way would be Merrickville. And you can see Ragtime docked here. And this is looking west through the same lock. There was a storm coming in. This particular lock, you can see it's open now, and what you can see here is the low water level and the high water level. This lock in particular has the lowest lift of any lock on the Rideau Canal. It only goes up and down 2.2 feet. What's the point of that? There is a point. And I got too much text here, but the original plan was to take advantage of a SNIE, an SNIE, which is a shallow, dry passageway beside the river. That would be a place where the river would flow at high water. And so they would use that spot to build the canal. And they would place a dam across the main part of the river to raise the water level above that spot. And they put the lock in between. They were looking for a 4-foot lift, but Colonel By ran into problems at this location. There was another swampy low area that wasn't documented in the survey. So once they built the lock, they found that in fact, the water could flow around the whole thing, not through the river channel, but through another low area. That was one problem. The other was the smell of digging in this swampy area. And in the muddy sort of texture of the land, there were also large boulders that were unanticipated. And that made work difficult. And then finally, there was malaria, and many of the men refused to work. So I'll read Colonel By on this. He says, in commencing the works in the SNIE, the effluvia arising from disturbing the soil was so offensive and of such a malignant nature as to occasion great sickness. So much so that the laborers refused to continue the necessary clearing and grubbing, which had been partly executed. It was also ascertained that the deepening of the SNIE in question would have to attend with a much heavier expense than foreseen, for instead of soft mud, the removal of which was estimated at 194 pounds. The excavation proved to consist of very large boulders, more difficult from their hard nature to remove than solid rock. Because, you know, how do you get a heavy boulder out of mud? Move it. A much greater extent of excavation was also required than provided for in the estimate given to the committee, arising from the necessity of cutting off points in the SNIE and the additional width required in order to form direct entrances for steamboats into the lock. This is part of the sort of progress reports that Colonel By was sending back to his superiors, and this is the stuff that they didn't like to hear. So he had solutions, and the solutions were to lower the height of the dam and the lift of the lock by 2 feet, which is why instead of it being a 4-foot lock, now it's a 2-foot lock. But also to run an embankment to sort of cut off water to locate the canal cut a little differently and deepening, basically throw money at the problem. And that's what he did. So these are the parts that you can see now. The Snee is where the lock was dug. The embankment is part of raising that water level. The dam and the rapids are there. Along the Rideau Canal too, you come across a lot of bridges. And starting at Kingston, which struck me was the LaSalle Causeway Bascule Bridge. This was built in 1917. You can drive across this bridge any day. It's a single leaf Strauss heel trunnion bascule bridge. What does all that mean? A bascule bridge is a balanced bridge, so the heavy end and the long end and the short end are both pretty much the same weight, which is why you got all that weight out of the back end here. Single leaf, don't worry. But a Strauss bascule bridge, first of all, do you recognize this bridge? In the Portlands? Yeah, it's the same designer, Strauss, and the same design, about the same era. Strauss was building and designing and building these bridges. So there's one in the Portlands. There used to be another one in the Portlands over there. That's other history. Strauss was also later the designer of the Golden Gate Bridge, the suspension bridge in San Francisco. There's another bascule bridge along the route. It's called a Scherzer Rolling Lift Bascule Bridge. And you can sort of see it's different. Basically, it's like a rocking chair. It's the Strauss, oops, back. The Strauss has a pivot up here. Right. The Scherzer doesn't have the pivot there. It just rolls back and forth on that part right there. So it's like a rocking chair. So this was a railway bridge taken out of use in 1978, but they've left it there for its historic value. You see that just coming into Smiths Falls. This is a list of bridges, and I sort of gathered them into categories. You've got a bunch of swing bridges, Kilmarnock being one. You've got fixed bridges, mostly they're the ones, I mean, there are large fixed bridges. The 401 is a fixed bridge. You know, think of that as a bridge over the Rideau Canal, but in fact it is. There are the two bascule bridges that I was pointing out, and there are some other bridges. Coming into Ottawa, for example, there are fixed bridges, and those fixed bridges give you a maximum height of 22 feet on the lowest clearance. So. Here's the swing bridge at Kingston Mills. Same idea as Kilmarnock, but much newer sort of mechanism there. And it's swinging a longer bridge. It's swinging this bridge. So actually what you see here at Kingston Mills, in fact, is a bridge and a blockhouse in the same, and the canal in the same view. So this the first bridge in this location was not a bridge like this. It was a fixed timber bridge, and it was built around 1801. Later bridges, this is not obviously an original bridge anymore over the Rideau Canal, but it's still in place as a swing bridge. When things got busier, for example, in Smiths Falls, the traffic on the bridge got so much that it didn't make sense to be swinging the bridge for boats on the Rideau Canal. So they built another section of canal and put a fixed bridge over. That's another story. Here's an example of the fixed bridges in Ottawa. You're going under, if you like, up to Ottawa. And what I've put in here, and you can look at it if you want online, are references to sources that I was looking at partly, but also, what you can see here, there's a lot of information on one website called RideauInfo.com. It's the single person's project, but it's an enormous collection of information. The other is Parks Canada has gathered all kinds of information on their website with Rideau Canal. So any questions? Or experiences? Yes.
What were they turning in the turning base?
Um,
Like the turning.
the turning basins would be sometimes for boats. It's usually, sorry, a multi-lock. Did I do that? It's okay. Multi-lock stations where you have traffic going two ways. So you could have boats go into the turning basin and boats go the other way, without having to clear boats all the way down a flight of locks before boats could go the other way up. That's the main use of the turning basins. I think at Merrickville, you find side sort of spots where you can pull over and boats can pass you going the other way. This turning basin at Kingston Mills and this one at Jones Falls, I think would allow stuff to be loaded on and then returned the other direction as well. Yes,
You mentioned that the blue line is where you dock in order to wait to go into the lock. Where do you, well, how long does it take to go from one end to the other?
to go from one end of the lock to another.
No, the one end of from Kingston to Ottawa, how long does that take?
I think you should give about 6 days one way.
Okay, and so then my question is, where do you dock overnight?
You can stop at most of the locations on the dock walls. The locks close at 5 or 6 p.m. and you can just tie up there. Some of them have power. If you want to tie on with power,
Oh, yes, you
it's
mentioned.
it's kind of a first come, first served arrangement, but it seemed to work. Yeah. Yes, Bill.
I was gonna say that the fourth of Voyager, I think it takes a week. And they dock every night because you don't drive at night. And they have set mooring places or set anchorings that they use.
And you have done the Voyager.
Yeah, we've done that. The cabins are the width of two very neat, narrow, single beds and one window. So in the picture. And the food is it's not cruise liner, ocean cruise liner cuisine, but it's quite stable. Quite I was saying that the Port of Voyager takes about a week to get from one end to the other. They tie up overnight or anchor overnight. The food is not the same as you would get on an ocean cruise ship, but there's plenty of it. It's basic, it's tasty, and it's a fun trip.
Yes, I encountered the Port of Voyager, one of the locks. There was an area that was marked out for the Port of Voyager to dock when it arrived. And it arrived later the same day, stayed overnight at that location. Any other questions? If you can just throw the presentation up again, there was one thing that Bill already answered. But for those who were wondering about the seagulls, that's why they stay off the red marks. Yes, Sherry.
I was just surprised when you mentioned malaria. I always thought malaria was more of a southern climate.
Yeah, so Sherry's surprised about malaria as an Ontario thing. It existed. I don't think anybody gets it now in the Kawarthas or so on, but it did at the time. Yeah.
It's mosquitoes
Mosquitoes, which we do have.
in abundance.
Oh, genetic.
Any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you very much.
I just have to comment again, Ron, I am always so impressed with, one, your organization, two, the research you do to do your presentations.
And so I thank you very, very much for all the work you've done in order to get this presentation ready and for your knowledge and willingness to share it. Let's give him another big round. Now, you have a token of appreciation there for you, if you would like it. Thank you. Ron has received a few of these, and so we'll save that, then there's somebody else. So, next week, we have Larry Rennie.